Hi, Jamie. Hi, Aaron. Pleasure to have you on this episode of Vaartaalaap. How are you guys doing?
Doing great, thanks. Thanks for having us on.
Great, great too. So, for my listeners, let me introduce a little bit about Jamie. Jamie is a sports performance director at the New Zealand campus of Innovation and Sport. He's also a director of VX Sport and the founder of Accelerometers Sports Training Institute. He possesses over 20 plus years of work experience in the sports industry. He has been training people from grassroots to professional sports as a strength and conditioning coach. Anything that you wish to add further to this, Jamie?
No, you've summed it up pretty well. I'm currently working with a few teams around the world, but predominantly I'm working in the New Zealand rugby scene over here. We've thankfully just got back out in the field again recently, which has been great.
Yeah.
And my women's team here called the Black Ferns, we're currently preparing for a World Cup next year. So that's about the size of what I'm up to.
Okay, and Arun is currently managing the reselling business for VX Sports as well as one other company based out of Switzerland. Anything that you wish to add to that, Arun?
No, that is all. That's what they've been doing fantastically well, and all help from Jeremy. It's helping us to go and reach the customers. That's
great.
It.
So I too have a lot of sports appetite since my childhood. I was brought up playing many sports, especially outdoor sports, football and cricket, and then indoor sports as well as badminton. And I had a good career at Adidas in Germany as well for close to 5 years. So Jamie, you are doing so many different things. One of the things that I wanted to understand from you was especially in terms of strength and conditioning. When we talk about sports, there is performance on the pitch, there is performance in training, and then there is training to avoid injuries. How do you see strength and conditioning having evolved in the last 20 odd years?
Sure. Look, I think what's happened in the last 20 odd years is there's more and more sports these days becoming professional, which generally means the athletes got better access to support staff. It means we have more physiotherapists, more doctors, more strength and conditioning coaches, but as much as anything, we have more time with the athletes. And having that time with the athletes makes a huge difference to us. Like we can do a lot of conditioning and education training remotely, but once we get our hands back on the athletes and see them face to face, there's so much more you can tell. Those, as much as technology is really important these days, the relationship with the athlete and being able to see them face to face is also hugely important.
Okay, so can you cite any examples from the sports that you deal with as to how strength and conditioning has been probably useful to them in last maybe say 10 years? Any specific athletes that you can talk about?
Yeah, sure. I think what we see also has changed is that over the years you see different theories and different equipment come and go. And so over time you see things like Swiss balls, or you see different types of weight training equipment, or whatever it might be. There's different phases that things come and go. But more recently, we're becoming much better at just collecting information that we need. We're much better at understanding the principles of technology. And as a result, we are much better as well as helping the athlete manage their training volumes. And that's probably the number one biggest thing these days is how we manage training load. We've become a lot better at avoiding the big spikes in training and the big drops in training as well. And there's guys out there like Tim Gabbett, who has got some really good research out there on how to reduce the chance of injury by managing people's training loads, progressively training to a point where we're building up tolerance. And so I think with the idea that athletes now are training more often, participating at elite levels more often, we're getting much better at managing training volume and training load. And I know how big cricket is in India, and the Indian cricket team is one team that's physically improved their fitness a huge amount the last few years. And not just now are they so strong technically and tactically and got very good players, they've also got a very good strength and conditioning coach in Nick Webb, who ensures they're physically ready to play and able to tolerate those high loads. So by using technology, we can better manage load, and by using that technology in an appropriate way, we ensure there's not those big drops in training or those spikes in training that previously we may have missed.
Okay, so how do you actually go out charting a course for training? Because you will have different needs in rugby, you will have different needs in football, and you will have different needs in cricket. How do you go about creating a training plan from a strength and conditioning perspective?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question, because these days we have so much information available to us to try and help structure those plans. As an example, with VX Sport, those little boxes alone, they're capturing over 1 million data points every 90 minutes. Those different data points form up over 350 different columns of data. That's what we could possibly look at. Now, as you say, every sport requires different physical strengths, different technical and tactical outcomes as well. So in rugby, it might be very important for us to measure high-speed running. The number of impacts, the number of accelerations might be very important, and maybe distance travel. Now, if we look at a game of rugby, in a game of 15s rugby, you might be traveling somewhere around 7,000 meters, might be on average. If you compare that to a game of test cricket, the wicket keeper alone might be traveling over 25 kilometers in one day. And that wicket keeper is also going through in excess of sort of 500 body weight squats by the time they squat down for every delivery and stand up again. So the dynamics of what a wicket keeper might need for cricket and what a rugby player might need is very, very different. So the thing around developing their strength and conditioning plans is understanding what things are important to measure and how we use them to get them fitter, faster, and stronger. So rugby and cricket are very, very different dynamics. Once we understand what the game demands are, we can start building up their plans. And I think I tend to program in a very concurrent way. So I use both speed, strength, endurance, all the way through my season. So we try and do we do an integration of all those modalities all the way through the season, because we are having to play so much during the year now. It's not just a winter sport. And cricket's very much the same. They spend a long time on the road. The difference being, for individual sports, they may be looking to peak for 2, 3, or 4 events a year, and they're very specific in when those times are. So their method of training and conditioning can be very different. They can build their training up by doing like an aerobic base and then moving into more the anaerobic systems, and same with strength. They go from strength to power. So depending on the sport and how many times you play every year, how you program is going to be very, very different.
Okay. So one more thing around training would be, there was a lot of clamor for cardio training in the past. Has some of that gone into oblivion with the strength and conditioning becoming more popular?
The cardiovascular training is still very important. It's still your base. And I guess what we know about fatigue is there is a high cardio component to that still. And when you're under fatigued, you're more likely to make mistakes, either mental mistakes or technically and tactically you're making poor decisions as well. It also means that sometimes your physical skills don't hold up under pressure. So there's still very much a need for developing cardiovascular fitness. However, when it comes down to training the athlete, we also know, when I talk about rugby players, when they run 7,000 meters in a game, it's not just done in a continuous, steady run. And that's what cardiovascular training is. It's long, steady runs, essentially. However, for a rugby player, stopping, starting, changing directions, doing things at higher speed, those high intensity efforts are more how we determine whether the athlete is effective or not. So whilst cardiovascular training is important, more so these days, it's the high intensity efforts that really defines how effective that player can be on the field.
Okay. So in terms of technology, I mean, what I saw at Adidas was there was a lot of clamor for wearables, team systems which were being used by clubs like Bayern Munich or AC Milan or Real Madrid. What kind of technology is coming into this conditioning or sports in general that you see now?
Oh, look, I think you're right to say that wearables still play a really massive role in what we're seeing in terms of the evolution of technology. I think it's also really important to recognize that when we talk about sports performance, you asked for examples earlier around how technology may change sport. Well, we have to only look back at swimsuits. We know that the records for swimming changed dramatically when the swimsuit design changed. We know that in cricket, in golf, in tennis, when the implements changed, when the cricket bat dimensions changed, when the golf clubs become more scientifically designed, when tennis rackets become stronger, you hit the ball harder, you hit it further.
Yeah.
So when we look about how technology influences sport, it's not just as wearables device, it's in the equipment, it's in the clothing that we wear. With wearable devices, they're now capturing more data than ever. We used to start off by just measuring GPS, and it was sampling at 4 times per second. So they call that a 4 hertz device. Now, most devices are at least 10 hertz. So they're measuring 10 times a second.
Okay.
On top of that, and that's for doing things like speed and distance and sprinting.
Yeah.
Then you've also got accelerometers. Those accelerometers are measuring at 104 times per second across 3 different channels.
Okay.
They're measuring things like landing impacts on the ground. They're measuring collisions in rugby. You've got gyroscopes measuring rotation. You've got magnetometers measuring Earth's magnetic force and lean. You've got heart rate sensors, and they're all sitting inside a very small little box. The box the size of a matchbox. In fact, I think I've got one just here. We're essentially looking at a box like that.
Okay.
Is what the size of the devices are now.
Okay.
Also got systems where heart rate has changed.
Right.
So no longer do you need heart rate straps that are a little bit clunky and the athletes get annoyed wearing. We've got material-based sensors built into the vests that the athletes wear. And that conductive fabric can now measure heart rate. So wearable devices are changing. They're still playing a massive role.
Yeah.
We're seeing a lot of evolution as well in video technology. And the integration of those things is going to become more and more important.
Yeah.
So how can we use video in a tactical situation to also bring in the physical data and marry those 2 things up together? And I think that's where the next evolution of technology is going to be, is how those different technologies work together.
Okay, so you may hit the nail on the head. When you talk about evolution of technology, where is that going to come from? What's the next frontier? Maybe you can talk in terms of a sport, or is it just something that you can come up maybe based upon your experience?
Look, I think the next evolution in sport is how do we stop collecting just information, and how do we produce insights? So how do we create information that's not just interesting, but it provides insights in how we can create change?
Right.
So an example would be by collecting the heart rate data or the speed data. Does that change when the weather is colder, when it's hotter, when it's later in the game? Does it change when there's a player being sent off the field? Does it change when we're playing different opposition? So the relationship between data sets is going to be more and more important. And that's where I think the evolution is going to be, is understanding how data works together, or big data, they say, how it works together. So things like artificial intelligence or algorithms that are self-learning to know that when 2 things happen, the third is more likely. So if the athlete accelerates hard, does that mean they're more likely to be successful breaking the line in a game of rugby? Or does it mean when the bowler runs in a game of cricket, they run in fast, does that translate to higher bowling speeds? There's those sort of things that we're getting better at understanding. So the evolution, I don't believe, is necessarily in always new technology. It's working out how existing technology can be used more effectively. And so it's not always for us trying every new piece of technology that comes onto the market. It's often understanding how do we get more use out of things we already have. So we like to think about doing less things more. So getting really, really good at using the things that we already have.
Right. But which sport specifically do you think is becoming more technology centric apart from football and rugby? Where do you see the next frontier? Is it something like cricket, or is it more like pure athletics, track and field, where more you would see newer technologies coming up, or somewhere else?
I think it goes back to the previous answer a little bit as well, because I think what cricket are doing really well now is they're understanding how to use the accelerometers in, say, our units to measure landing forces when fast bowlers bowl.
Yeah.
And they can learn how that affects their stress on their body and their workload. And that gets them better at trying to manage the bowler's workload. And why that's different to what's happened in the past is, in the past, when you've measured a bowler's workload, you simply look at how many balls they've bowled. Well, we all know that when a bowler runs in, they don't always run in at the same speed, particularly when they're practicing. It varies, and that creates different stress on the body. So by looking at run-up speed, delivery speed, landing forces, and those things together, it gives us a better idea of how intense that movement is. So I think cricket, a bit like baseball, we're very good at measuring performance stats.
Right.
We love to know the average of cricket players and how many runs they've scored, how many wickets they've taken,
Yeah.
how effective they are against different bowlers.
Yeah.
But I think where it's going to change for cricket is in using technology, it'll give them even more insights. So I guess for me, what's interesting is some of the technology we use in sport is now being applied in other sectors. So it's been applied to the military. The military are now using our types of technology to see how effective soldiers are in the field. They're trying to use technology to see when they're wearing a very heavy pack, when they're carrying that, or a different type of boot, how does it affect them physically? So if they're wearing certain boots or carrying heavier packs, how much does it slow them down? Does it make them slower, but they've got more equipment, which makes them better prepared? That's the balance. Or it's even in education. How can we use sports data to teach? So because people like you and I, we love playing sport, we often learn mathematics through sport.
Yeah.
We begin to understand calculating a player's average because we're interested in that. Well, sports data that we collect can help in the same way. We can teach very complex math and science through the data coming off the units, which makes it more attractive for schools. So I think there's a few evolutions in the existing technology, but also we know that as time evolves, the technology becomes faster, the sampling rates become higher, the technology becomes smaller, which allows more applications. You only have to look back, I think it was around the 1960s, where really the first precision timing lights were released at the Olympics, and we got down to 100th of a second. Now, these days, video footage takes 3,000 images per second. So the accuracy just improves further and further and further.
Yeah. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. Some technologies being dual use, and I remember the ball tracking technology in cricket came from missile tech. So one thing is in the statistics are interesting for a lot of people. I mean, especially in cricket, we love those performance stats. So some of these are related to the performance of an athlete. Some are related to the fan bases as well. I mean, how do you see that amalgamation of the two things, two different use cases, things being interesting for the fans versus for the performance of an athlete? How do they converge?
Yeah, great. So I think what we're seeing now is you've got your performance information, your public information.
Yeah.
And the performance information is very detailed, and it's often looking at things that the public aren't familiar with. It's not telling a story about the athlete.
Yeah.
Whereas the public information is they're very interested in things like what is their current heart rate, how far have they run, and it tells a story. So we want to know whether Kane Williamson or Virat Kohli, how far have they run when they've been batting today?
Yeah.
And they understand that from it's an interesting statistic.
Yeah.
However, it's more so for the strength and conditioning coach or the nutritionist or the physiotherapist. There's another layer of information sitting underneath that's more detailed. They're looking for how many accelerations the athlete has made, or they might be looking for the energy consumption of the athlete so they can fuel the athlete better, help them to recover better. Whereas the consumer, back on the couch, the fan, they're more looking for a story of comparing one athlete versus another. They want to know who traveled further. Was it Virat or was it Kane?
Yeah.
And it's like a bit of a contest.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily the number. It's, well, who's done more today?
Yeah.
And they judge people on who's done more or who's done less and things like that. So I think, generally speaking, we're also getting better at merging that data into the broadcast. And cricket fans and rugby fans are now used to seeing some of that performance data pop up on the screen. But for us in our teams, we're also not trying to give away our performance advantage. And it's sort of like baking a cake. I can give you all the ingredients to bake the cake, but you can still burn it if you get it wrong. So sometimes the information that we share is enough to get people interested and understand an insight, but it's not giving away our performance advantage.
Yeah. So one thing which I learned probably a few years back, and you can correct me there, Jamie, rowing as a sport is said to be one of the toughest in terms of training.
Rowing?
Rowing. I read it somewhere. I'm not too sure whether it's true that it's one of the toughest to train for. Maybe because a lot of people have to train together, and then it's probably hard. I don't know. I just don't understand how come it's so tough. Maybe you can comment on it. Is it really the toughest sport in terms of training?
Yeah, look, I think things like rowing and cross-country skiing are probably two examples of very difficult sports. One, for me, they're quite monotonous,
Okay.
which means you're just on repeat. And so they haven't, that variation in training is much harder to do, where in sports like cricket and rugby and soccer, football, there is more variation in training. So having that variety in your training stimulus is actually easier in some ways. Not saying that it's every sport is hard to be at the top of your game, but team sports allow for that variation. Rowing cardiovascularly is extremely difficult. The hours they train is usually really early in the morning as well.
Okay.
It suits a certain body type. You've got athletes, generally they've got really long limbs, tall athletes, so they take a lot of fuel. And then cross-country skiing, similar in the fact that it's a repetitive movement, but you're also performing at altitude. So it's a really hard stress in the body. Other sports that are quite physically demanding, and you have to be very good at all disciplines in triathlon these days. You must be good on the bike. You must be good as a swim and a run. And if you're not, you get found out. However, in a game of cricket or rugby, we usually are very good at the whole game, but very, very good at a certain part of it. So we tend to isolate our focus down to certain aspects or disciplines.
Okay.
But yeah, I think you're right. There are a couple of sports that you mentioned, or rowing in particular, that is a physically a very high demand sport, or a physically a very challenging sport.
Okay. Coming back to the training part of it, injury management, and I think you briefly talked about it. Can you detail out as to what are some of the key activities in terms of training or in terms of technology which are helping currently in injury management across sports?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me bring up a screen here, and I'll illustrate for you if you like.
Sure.
Just a couple of the things that we're looking for. I think you've currently got your screen sharing disabled. Can you enable that for me?
Sure. Just that.
And what I want to show you here is just an example of how we use technology to look at how we've got spikes in our training load or troughs in our training load. And for every sport, the things that we want to measure that determine load are going to differ, like we said. Whether it's cricket or rugby or soccer, the things that we measure will change, and they will determine what load looks like. What we tend to do when we are looking at injury management is we plot the load over a course of either 7 days, which they refer to as the acute period of your load monitoring, or the chronic phase, which is a longer phase, which is usually up to a month.
Yeah.
Now, my idea around that is we often change what the acute period, the short period, and the chronic period, the longer period, look like.
Okay.
So instead of being 1 week in a month, we may look at the data over a short period of time, like 4 or 5 days, and the competition that we're playing in might only last a 20-day tournament. So that might be the full length of our data that we're looking at. So every sort of 4 days or 5 days, we're rolling the load scores over an average and looking at how that fluctuates for every athlete. What we can also do during that time is understand, based on the game demands that we've talked about, so things like high intensity running, impacts, distance travel, we can find out which of those metrics the athlete is getting too much of or not enough of.
Okay.
What we don't want to do is underexpose them. So we don't want to train them lightly that they're not getting exposed to lots of high intensity efforts or lots of high intensity runs. Because if we trained an athlete like that, when they got into match performance and they're required to do those things, then that's when they're at high risk of injury.
Okay.
Likewise, at the other side of that, we don't want to overtrain the athlete. We don't want to train them too much so they don't get time to recover. Recovery is still king. And we spend a lot more time these days, or emphasis, on helping the athlete recover. So strategies around recovery are hugely important. And you talk about technology, what's changed there? We've now got devices out there that increase blood flow around the body to try and stimulate better recovery. We've got better compression garments. We've got devices like the Normatec and Game Readies that help the athlete recover faster.
Okay.
We've got cryotherapy that people are experimenting with. And cryotherapy is a technology that is gaining momentum now as well, which is going to be quite interesting in terms of where that technology might become more accessible for the athletes. At the moment, it's a pretty expensive technology, but from what we're seeing, it's pretty effective. So it's going to be interesting to see over time how research guides that as being a recovery principle that people might like to use or not. But recovery is hugely important in terms of how we avoid injuries.
Possibly the same approach was used by Manchester United to bring Pogba back in their team from injury, I guess.
Yeah, well, the EPL teams, English Premier League teams, are using cryotherapy. You're only exposed to it for a very short period of time, but it's a really dry, intense ice bath, if you like. And on the back of that, it's become quite popular in American sport as well, through basketball and through American football. And we're slowly seeing some of those chambers make their way down our side of the world as well.
Okay, cool. So one last thing that I wanted to understand from you was what is VX Sports doing? What are you into? Can you probably give some inclination about that?
Yeah, look, so VX Sport, we work across over 250 teams internationally. We do a lot of work in America. We do a lot of work with very different sports across cricket, we've worked with Red Bull on downhill mountain biking. We've worked in horse racing. We do a lot of work in rugby and soccer. And we change our approach depending on what sport we go into to what metrics that we measure. So it changes from sport to sport. But what doesn't change is we have to try and always keep the athletes on the field, keep them injury free, and help try and win more games. And so that's largely how you get judged. Are you adding value to the program in terms of performance, and are you helping to prevent injuries? So VX Sport now has been going for over 10 years. We're a little company here in New Zealand. We make all our equipment here in New Zealand, and we send it out all across the world. So VX Sport, we've got a lot of different applications around sport, education, and the military. We established in 2007, and then in 2008, we first sent out our first unit. That was our Generation 1 unit. Now in 2019, we released our Generation 5 unit. And in 2020, we're already looking at what happens next. So Generation 6 won't be that far away. There's a couple of things that I know Richard Snow, the CEO and technical engineer, the lead tech, he's working on some pretty cool innovations. So over the time, things have changed. The units have become smaller. The amount of data they collect has increased. The amount of sensors inside the unit has increased. We look after over 250 teams worldwide, over 30 countries, everything from horse racing to military applications to soccer to rugby, downhill mountain biking, surfing. Actually, you can see Kelly Slater's jandals behind me up on the wall. Thongs.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so we get across a lot of sports, and it's both from a performance aspect, it's from education aspect, and it's from broadcast. So we often stream data into TV broadcasts, and over the years we've done it for Channel 9 cricket. We were otherwise known as the Booper Tracker for cricket. We've done it for horse racing. We've done it for a lot of different events, including rugby as well. So VX, we make everything here in New Zealand. All the components are made here in Christchurch in New Zealand. We have our software team sits up in Auckland, and our headquarters is in Wellington. So we're up and down the country.
So you are looking both at individual as well as team sports, then, right?
Look, the platform was designed for teams. What's happened recently is, particularly during COVID, we had a lot of athletes that were having to train by themselves remotely. So we adapted the platform so athletes could take home their own individual unit, and they could take home their unit and plug it into their device, their computer, and the information is being sent back centrally to a coach. So we adapt and we evolved. We made the system so it could work a lot better for athletes as well as, individual athletes as well as team sports.
Right. So it's been a pleasure having you today, Jamie, and you, Arun, as well. We had some hiccups, but the information that you have provided is simply breathtaking. I'm pretty sure that some of my viewers will love to see and know more about VX Sports as well. And we live in a country which is cricket crazy, and I'm sure someday VX Sports will be a big name in cricket as well. Thank you. Thanks for your
Look,
time today.
no, look, thank you. We'd love to come across and see you sometime, and I'm sure we can do a cricket workshop for you.
Yeah,
And if
sure.
your viewers have got specific questions, please send them through, and we'll
Sure.
do our best to answer them either via email or we can answer it on another call like this. Thanks again.
Sure. Great. Thank you. Have a good evening and have a good afternoon, Aaron.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Have a great
Bye-bye.
day, guys.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.